Hello everyone and welcome to the presentation of our paper titled Sentiment Analysis of Russian IRA Troll Messages on Twitter During US Presidential Elections of 2016. My name is Osama Yaqub and my co-authors in this study are Mujtaba Ali Malik and Salma Zaman. So what is the problem that we are addressing in this paper? Well, the role of Russian Internet Research Agency, better known as IRA, on social media discourse surrounding the 2016 US presidential elections has many question marks over it. There have been allegations that IRA tried to influence the election in favor of Donald Trump by spreading fake news on social media. These allegations led to the congressional inquiry and subsequent report of Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian influence on the 2016 US elections. No definitive conclusions were drawn from the investigation that the outcome of 2016 elections was shaped by fake news efforts. However, since then there has been a larger debate on the influence of social media on elections around the world. This problem is important because social media activity has surged in recent years. Global number of active social media users has increased considerably over the last 5 years. In addition to this, a 2018 Pew Research Center study reported that 68% of American adults at least occasionally get news on social media. Due to this popularity of social media and the fact that a large number of adults use it as a news source has led to it becoming an effective tool to spread fake news to a receptive audience. Studies have also claimed that fake news spreads faster on Twitter than real news. Another study has also looked at the role of automated account on some of the largest social media platforms and have claimed that as many as 190 million automated accounts exist on three of the most popular social media platforms. That's Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Along with bots, there are trolls, which are human operated accounts that can also play a significant role in spreading fake news on social media. The IRA is allegedly one such organization that has been accused of spreading fake news during the US presidential elections of 2016. So what's our contribution? Well, in this paper we analyze tweets created by IRA on Twitter. We look at two hypotheses. Firstly, we evaluate the sentiment of IRA tweets and retweets towards the two presidential candidates, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Secondly, we evaluate the difference in sentiment between IRA and non-IRA tweets towards these two presidential candidates. We utilized two datasets for this study. The first dataset, that we refer to as the election discourse dataset, was collected during the 2016 elections using the Twitter streaming API. We utilized keywords Trump, Clinton, and election 2016 to download tweets. These tweets were gathered between 30th of October to 18th of November 2016, and we collected over 51 million messages in this dataset. The second dataset, which we refer to as the IRA dataset, was released by Twitter in October 2018. This dataset contains 8.8 million tweets from accounts that Twitter verified as Russian IRA accounts, and these messages were created between 2009 to 2018. In our study, we took an overlap of tweets between our election discourse dataset and the IRA dataset. We discovered 1,308 unique tweets created by IRA accounts in our election discourse dataset. These 1,308 tweets were retweeted over 110,000 times in our election discourse dataset. We performed sentiment analysis of these messages using Wader which is a rule-based sentiment lexicon model. Vader is attuned for microblogging texts and is effective in analyzing sentiment of short messages such as tweets. Vader assigns a score between +1 and -1 to the texts that it analyzes. A score of +1 or close to +1 indicates an extremely positive sentiment, while a score of -1 or close to -1 indicates an extremely negative sentiment, while 0 indicates neutral sentiment. So as I mentioned, we created two hypotheses in this study. Our first hypothesis deals with the IRA tweets and retweets. It consists of two parts. Hypothesis 1A states that the sentiment of IRA messages mentioning Donald Trump was more positive when compared with the sentiment of IRA messages mentioning Hillary Clinton. Our hypothesis 1B states that the sentiment of retweets of IRA tweets in our election discourse dataset had a better sentiment towards Donald Trump than Hillary Clinton. Our second hypothesis compares IRA tweet sentiment with non-IRA tweet sentiment. Our hypothesis 2 states that the sentiment of messages by IRA account had a more positive sentiment towards Donald Trump and a more negative sentiment towards Hillary Clinton when compared with the sentiment of non-IRA messages on Twitter during the 2016 US presidential elections. We now look at the analysis and results of our hypotheses. As mentioned, we discovered 1,308 unique IRA tweets in our election discourse dataset. Tweets that mentioned both or none of the candidates were discarded as we were evaluating the difference in sentiment between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. We found 645 unique IRA tweets that mentioned Trump and 248 unique IRA tweets that mentioned Clinton. We can see that we have favorable sentiment towards Donald Trump, as the average sentiment of 645 tweets that mentioned him has a slightly positive sentiment, while the average sentiment of 248 tweets that mentioned Clinton has a slightly negative sentiment. For our hypothesis 1B, we look at the retweets of these 1,308 tweets in our election discourse dataset. The 645 unique IRA tweets mentioning Trump were retweeted over 75,000 times, while the IRA tweets mentioning Clinton were retweeted just under 16,000 times. We created a time series of these tweets by taking daily average sentiment of tweets mentioning the two candidates. This graph shows us the average daily sentiment of tweets mentioning Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, and we can observe that on a majority of the days, Donald Trump has a more positive sentiment when compared with Hillary Clinton. We perform a t-test to see whether this difference in sentiment is significant. And we can see that the t-statistic value is higher than t-critical, and hence we can state that the difference in sentiment between the two candidates is statistically significant when we look at the messages, IRA messages that mentioned them. Now we look at the analysis and results of our hypothesis 2. For second hypothesis, we created two time series of daily sentiment between 30th of October and 18th of November 2016. The first time series compared sentiment of IRA and non-IRA tweets mentioning Donald Trump. The second time series compares sentiment of IRA and non-IRA tweets mentioning Hillary Clinton. This graph shows us the comparison of our time series 1, where we compare IRA and non-IRA messages on Twitter mentioning Donald Trump. We discovered over 30,000 non-IRA tweets in our dataset that mentioned Donald Trump only. We performed a sentiment comparison between IRA and non-IRA tweets using t-test, and we could not discover a statistically significant difference between the two sentiments. Our second time series compares the sentiment of IRA and non-IRA messages mentioning Hillary Clinton. Here we can see that for majority of the days, IRA tweets had a much negative sentiment when compared with the non-IRA tweets. For our second time series, we discovered around 7.8 million non-IRA tweets mentioning Hillary Clinton in our election discourse dataset. We could see that IRA tweets had a more negative sentiment towards Hillary Clinton when compared with the non-IRA tweets. Our t-test also shows that the difference is statistically significant. Hence, in discussing our results, we can state that IRA troll accounts were indeed attempting to create a more favorable image of Donald Trump compared to Hillary Clinton on Twitter. We couldn't find conclusive evidence of IRA troll accounts portraying Donald Trump more favorably when compared with the overall discourse taking place on Twitter that mentioned him. We do, however, conclude that IRA troll accounts were indeed portraying Hillary Clinton more negatively when compared with the Twitter election related discourse. For future work, we'd like to perform topic modeling of IRA tweets to identify the terms and topics that were mentioned in their Twitter messages during the US elections of 2016. We'd also like to evaluate the role of automated accounts in spreading IRA tweets on Twitter. Thank you for listening to this presentation. Have a nice day.